Good afternoon. My name is Mary Opperman, and I'm the Vice President and Chief Human Resources Officer at Cornell University. I'm here today with three colleagues to discuss their career experiences in the field of labor management relations. Nicole and I actually have spent most of our careers supporting on the management side, and Randy and Sam have spent most of their careers representing labor. During the first part of this program, we will be discussing career paths in labor and management relations and the impact of women leadership in the field. The second part of the program will be an opportunity for you all to ask questions. You can put your questions right in the chat, and our colleagues at eCornell will get them to us so we can answer as many of them as possible. This round table is sponsored by a grant from the President's Council for Cornell Women, and this is the last in a three-part series. The recorded version of the previous panels are available on the eCornell Keynote website. And as a note, today's conversation is being recorded and can be viewed at the same URL immediately following today's session. The grant is also sponsoring a fellowship opportunity for Cornell students in labor and employment policy and practice for the summer of 2022, this coming summer. You can find more information on the fellowship opportunity by going to experience.cornell.edu and keyword search PCCW. So I'm going to begin now with some quick introductions, and we're going to ask our panelists to tell us a little bit about themselves. You have their very impressive backgrounds on the keynote registration page, but I would like to give them a quick chance just to introduce themselves, and then I'm going to come back and ask them each some questions. Randy, would you like to start?
Sure. First off, I'm delighted to be here. My name is Randy Weingarten. I'm the president of the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers. It's a 1.7 million member union, the largest union now in the AFL-CIO. And we represent a lot of people who make a difference in the lives of others, from teachers and bus drivers to we're the second largest nurse union now and the largest higher education union. But probably for this panel, I am an ILR graduate, 1980 graduate. Somebody else can do the math there. And I have remained very active in my support of the school. And I still either love or loathe reading, depended on what hour of night it is. Unfortunately, I will not be able to stay for the whole session. And so if there are questions to me at the end, I'd be delighted to answer them later, and we can get those on the website. I have, unfortunately, something that is pulling me that I have to go back to.
Thank you, Randy, and we're grateful for the time that you can give us. And we know that this came up at the last minute and is very, very important. So thank you for being here. Sam, let me turn to you.
Hello, everyone. I am delighted to be here, as is President Weingarten. I am Samantha Delaney. I am General Counsel to the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees. We are also affiliated with the AFL-CIO. We are the largest union representing backstage workers in live theater and in television, motion picture, trade show, and concerts. So I look forward to this panel, Mary, Nicole, and President Weingarten.
Sam, thank you so much. We look forward to hearing more from you. And Nicole.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Nicole Buffalano. I'm also delighted and really humbled to be on a panel with these really amazing women leaders. I am a partner in the Los Angeles office at Morgan Lewis. I practice labor management relations. I wasn't always on management side. I was with the government for a long time. At the beginning of my career, I started with the National Labor Relations Board in Region 2 in Manhattan. I was there for about 6 years and then transferred out to Region 31 in Los Angeles and was there for about 2 years. So I'm looking forward to discussion today, and thanks very much for having me.
Well, thank you, Nicole. I appreciate your comments. So we're going to jump right into this because we have kind of a busy agenda, and I'm going to just ask some questions and sort of use the order that we just did introductions to get us started. So Randy, what sparked your interest in labor relations?
Well, thank you for that question, Mary. And I also want to say thank you for being on this panel. I am really honored. But Sam, you have to promise me one thing. We don't do union rules here, and don't call me President Weingarten, call me Randy. I try to say that in the Executive Council all the time, but please, at least for this panel, we're all here together to educate kids and to be together as peers. So thank you in advance. So look, I'm a kid whose mom was a teacher and whose father was an electrical engineer, and second generation Americans. In this moment of time, it's pretty prophetic to say that, since my grandparents both came from Ukraine, and I just was doing a fact-finding mission in Poland and Ukraine at the behest of the Polish Teachers Union and working there. But it is a kind of immigrant story in terms of how my parents and family, was involved in education, not so much in labor, but involved in education, and became a part of the middle class as a result of it. My interest in labor was, frankly, watching my mother, who was a Nyack, New York school teacher, be on strike for 6 to 7 weeks. And as many who are in New York know, the public sector labor law has pretty draconian penalties for people who go on strike in the public sector. 2 days pay is lost for every day you're on strike. And you still pay your taxes, by the way. So my mother would often get, after the strike, a negative check in terms of what she owed the Nyack school system after the strike. But the point I don't just remember my grandmother making rugelach for the strike lines. What I remember most about this, and I saw it with my father's work, my mother's work, and then all throughout my career, was respect and dignity was the watchword. And how do regular folks, who, as Ann Richards would say, are not born with a silver spoon in their mouths, how do they have respect and dignity? And that's what the union movement, its best, is all about. Not only for the members we serve, but for the communities we serve. And so from that point on, I couldn't believe that there were actually labor relations schools that you could go to really learn about this, and just make a plug for the state schools, the land grant institutions of Cornell, because what happens is that is part of the public partnership for creating opportunity in whether it was ag, whether it was human ecology, whether it was the vet school, whether it was the ILR school, on things that were really important, that became ways of actually educating kids, not only in New York, but throughout the country. And so kind of one thing led to another. If you had asked me 20, 30, 40 years ago if I would ever have been a union president, I would have just said, "What are you, crazy?" In fact, I was left back in kindergarten for not speaking. So it is one of these roles and one of these journeys of tremendous opportunity, based upon being very mission driven, to really want every single public school in the United States to be a place where parents want to send their kids, educators want to work, and kids thrive. And I think about that, and I think about my mom pretty much every day in terms of how do we create respect, and dignity for the people who work for a living and who need that paycheck every single week or every single 2 weeks, and the people that we serve.
Thanks, Randy. I'm going to ask you a follow-up if that's okay. So it's clear that you're driven by the mission of AFT and the power of unions in terms of voice. I'm also interested in your own professional ambitions. And was there a moment, as you said, I never imagined myself as the president, but was there a moment or a series of moments where you began to realize the power of the leadership role to advance those missions? And can you tell us about that?
That's a really good question, Mary, and I'm glad you gave us the questions in advance so I could think about the answer to that and not just either be glib or, because I don't know about everybody else, but at least for me, a sense of humility is how I normally operate in the world. And so I often, when people said to me, you should do X and Z, I would often say, oh no, I'm not able to do that. I can't do that. I just, I didn't actually imagine that I could be out in front. I thought, I'll be behind the scenes. It would be, that's where I was more comfortable. I'll advise people. So I was really comfortable being a lawyer at Strzok & Levan, advising people. And I was pretty shocked when I was asked to actually leave Strzok to become counsel to the teachers union in New York City. Again, I was like, well, I don't know if I could really do that. But what I had, and this was that moment that you were talking about, what I had was, I had some really important mentors and rabbis, which I would call them, who actually said and looked at me and said, oh no, we need you to do this. We want you to do this. And I needed to actually have others show me that there was that potential for leadership. And what I saw in the reinforcement for me was teaching my kids at Clara Barton High School and being kind of the table manager in collective bargaining for the 1987 Teachers Board of Education contract. Because you could see how that leadership role and that role of not advising, but actually being the kind of final decision maker, how it really made a difference, whether those decisions were good or bad, but you were the enabler of moving people to a next stage, moving to a next thing. And over the course of time, I would say that this is now, next year will be, assuming, I have an election this year, but if I'm lucky enough to be reelected, next year will be my 25th year in a leadership role in either the local, which is a very complicated local, or the national, which is very complicated. And I'm really, really now more grateful today than I was then about these mentors of mine saying you can do it. And then having the imagination or having the support to believe in myself, and then seeing the difference that it makes to actually take the responsibility.
Thank you. That's great. And I'm going to come back to you to talk a little bit more about all of that, but it's fascinating. And I wonder if we're going to hear some themes here. So Sam, I'm going to turn to you next. Tell us about your interest in labor relations and a little bit about your career path into it.
Yes, I was going to say that Randy's story, save for the Ukraine piece, is a lot like mine. I my mother worked inside the home. My father is self-employed. He's a truck driver, but their siblings were all in the union, and everyone primarily is United Auto Workers, but we have a number of teachers and a number of nurses. And so when in the 80s, when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s and 90s, those were times when the UAW was on strike a lot. And so the stories were more than a headline or, the top story on the evening news. They were very real for my family because that meant that there wasn't a paycheck coming in because the family was on strike or they were furloughed. And so that had a very real influence on me early on. I did work on the management side briefly because when I graduated Columbia in 1994, there wasn't a labor opening. And so I worked on the employer side, performing insurance defense work. And I did that for about 18 months. But I'd stayed in touch with the public interest dean at Columbia, who was fabulous. We were friends. And so when a position opened at Spivak Lipton in New York City, which is a labor law boutique, she called me because there were Columbia alums at the firm. She had told them about me. She told me about them. And I was fortunate enough to be hired there. And I worked there for 13, 14 years before I came in-house at the IATSE. And the IATSE was one of Spivak's largest clients. And so I did a lot of work for the IA, which led to me coming here. So that, the very real family influence of having aunts and uncles and cousins, neighbors in the labor movement had a profound impact on me early on.
So Sam, tell us a little bit about the ascending to the role of general counsel, which is a very pivotal role, and how you made those decisions and sort of what guided you in making those decisions.
Again, I will say, echo what Randy said. It's opportunity, it's access, it's people seeing something in you that perhaps you don't see in or for yourself. I had the privilege of working for a general counsel for the IATSE, who's since gone on, Harold Spivak. And so I worked for him doing IA work. And then his son became general counsel. And the erstwhile general counsel, I am also very close with. And so the past two general counsels were the two who have mentored me, they sponsored me, and provided the opportunity and the access so that the international presidents, whose decision it ultimately is to hire counsel, so that they could see me. And I will say, I think there were a couple of things that stand out as I was thinking about the questions. I recall early on in my career, the IATSE was organizing a national theater chain and a movie theater chain. And box office revenue pre-pandemic was really governed by about 3 times of the year: Memorial Day, 4th of July, and the Thanksgiving, Christmas holidays. And the International was organizing a national theater chain, and it was a big deal. We had a number of high-profile social justice celebrity types who were involved. And so we were organizing around the holidays. and we were striking. There were job activities all across the country, job actions rather, all across the country. And I gave up a Thanksgiving holiday so that I could be on a strike line. And I believe that that stood out to the leadership, the commitment to workers, the commitment to providing representation for those who otherwise were outnumbered, outmanned, out everything. And similarly, about 10 years after that, an affiliated local of the International was organizing a legitimate theater house here. And we didn't think the employer would take a strike. Well, not only did they take a strike, they took a 6-week strike. And so the workers had no work for 6 weeks. And there was a 24-hour picket line. And I visited that line every day. And I believe that also got back to the powers that be. And they saw that there was more than just someone who, was a lawyer, but someone who was committed to the mission of the union and the mission of representing working people.
Thank you, Sam. There's so much already that I want to follow up with both you and Randy. Nicole, let me turn to you. Same questions. What sparked your interest in the labor relations field? And then a little bit about what prepared you for your current role.
So it's so interesting to hear the stories. I think how you grew up and where you grew up has so much to do with, your values and where you end up in your life. I grew up in Maryland, outside, very close to DC. So it wasn't, completely suburban, but it was pretty suburban. I think really sports is the one area in which I had ever heard of a union as I was growing up, right? Sports unions are so much out there. You hear about their negotiations, their sports strikes that everybody's aware of. So growing up, that was really I had an incredibly limited experience, which is very odd given that my mom was a head of human resources for a NASA facility and worked with lots of unions, but I never heard anything about it until I was older. And, so it just wasn't a part of my experience growing up. But I got into law school and I had an interest in labor relations because I was interested in sports generally. But I had a really brilliant labor law professor in law school who, I think a couple of things. One, I was just really intrigued that there was a law that said employees could get together and discuss wages, hours, and working conditions, and that needed to be a law. It just didn't strike me as something that, why wasn't this just the way that it is? Why did this need to be? So I was very interested in the labor history, and my really incredible labor law professor in law school said, you've got to take, and I was very lucky to be in law school in DC where we had lots of access to folks in government. And we had a class called Practice and Procedure before the NLRB that was taught by then General Counsel John Higgins, he was a Republican nominee, but this was when you could work with everybody, right? It wasn't like, oh, the general counsel is a Republican, that's a problem for the regional offices. Oh, the general counsel is a Democrat, and that's a problem for management. It wasn't that. I mean, there wasn't such a significant swing as we've seen sort of over the last, 10 years in terms of who the general counsel is. But in any event, his class and his commitment to the National Labor Relations Board was really inspiring to me. He sort of described this agency with this amazing mission that, his career was 50 years. And I was just, the idea of committing to something to me was really appealing. And so I thought this is an area that I really think is incredibly interesting. I think Randy's absolutely right. The idea of respect and dignity is what the National Labor Relations Act is about. And it was committing to something like that was really where I thought I could be helpful. And getting into the Region 2, I consider myself so very lucky to have started my career at the NLRB in Manhattan. I mean, hearing from Sam and Randy, you're all in New York. I mean, the labor in New York is incredible. It is like nowhere else. Even LA, I, have been here now for 10 years. It is not the same. I remember when you're a board agent, you sit in on what's called the information office, and people from the general public come in and they will ask you things about the law, and you'll direct them to other agencies. You'll tell them about the National Labor Relations Act. And I remember, on more than one occasion, people would come in, just regular workers walk in the Manhattan office, and they would say, "Hey, can I have the book?" And I'm like, "All right, what book?" And they would say, "The book, the one with all my rights in it." And as a labor lawyer, you're like, "Oh man, I wish there was such a book." There isn't. I can tell you about those rights, but that tells you what New York is about, I think, in a nutshell. But I think that experience for me really led me where I am today and gave me the tools that I needed for the position I'm in today. I think the tough thing that women face in leadership is feeling like you have something to contribute, like your opinion and your advice matters, and then being heard, right, in the environment. I think you can't do anything about the third one because, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this today, but there are, women often have issues being heard in the workplace, but you can do something about, knowing that you have something to contribute to the workplace and being able to speak up and be confident about those things. When I walked in the door at my first legal job in Region 2 in Manhattan at the NLRB, the regional director was an amazing, strong, brilliant leader. The regional attorney was an amazing, strong, brilliant leader. There were lots of supervisors that were women, that some of the best attorneys in the office were women. It really was such an incredibly supportive environment for women to speak up, to be heard, to have their opinion matter. I think that gave me, I see women now who start as associates, and we're an incredibly progressive firm with a really incredibly strong female leadership. But you have to help people along, right? And it was just part of the environment there. It was just the way that it was. All of our opinions mattered. All of our, advice mattered. And I think that really helped me get to where I am today, and also help the women who are coming up, that I'm working with now today, and understanding what, sort of meeting them where they are and encouraging them along too.
Nicole, that's great. And you've actually set the next series of questions up really well. So one of the reasons that we asked you all to join us is that, we do believe that women leaders in the area of labor relations are a critical component to moving this country forward, and also for the benefit of workers, which then benefits this country. And so we want to talk a little bit about women as leaders. I am guessing from my own personal experience that your career path might have been a little wobbly at times, or taken that you didn't see some of the things that might happen, maybe even some setbacks. And what I'd like to do is just ask you to think a little bit about that, those times when things went differently than you thought, what you learned from it, and what advice you would give to the future women leaders that are listening to you today. Randy, we'll start with you.
Oh, all of those setbacks. Now I would say that I learn more with the setbacks than with the victories. Although I would actually say that I didn't think that way as they were happening, to be quite honest. One of the, so I would just actually want to say one thing about what all three of us said. This is a very hard moment in the world and in the country. And you hear us all leading with gratitude. And I think that has actually, for me, the more joy I bring to the job, the more kind of, not a Pollyannish look, but optimism, and yes, with honesty, but a sense of what we can do as opposed to what we can't do. First off, makes me feel a lot better, and it makes the people around me feel hope. And I think, thinking about aspiration and versus anger, and hope versus, I'm not talking about we have to have righteous anger, and obviously I'm a union leader, but I don't, and this goes to your question now, Mary, I don't feel sorry for myself a lot. And I feel pretty lucky that every single day I get to work in what I think are I think that there are three opportunity agents for working people in the United States. One is voting. Another is education, pre-K through higher ed. And the third is labor. And I get to work pretty much every day in two of those three. So I think of myself as really lucky. Having said that, there's been a lot of stumbling blocks. And Nicole got to some of them. I think Sam was starting to talk about them too. And I would actually say in the labor movement, I think the issue about race as well as sex, really important that there weren't a lot of people that we could rely on or see ourselves in. As I won't talk for Sam, I'll talk for myself, but I spent a lot of time at the UFT and the AFT wanting to make the staff look like the members we represented and the kids we served and the hospitals we served. And without thinking about it as quotas or things like that, but really being intentional about how to make sure that people's lived experience was reflected in the people who were staffing. But as you come up, there are always stumbles. And so one stumble for me was I negotiated a contract in 1993, I think. It's 93, 94, 95, something in that area. Rudy Giuliani was mayor of the city of New York. Sandy was the president. Feldman was the president of the UFT. I was the general counsel at that point. I was a lawyer first before I was a high school social studies teacher. And it was a really terrible time, and there was no money. And we negotiated a long contract, but it had a couple of zeros at the head of it, and it got rejected. The only contract I've never negotiated that got rejected, but it got rejected. And I walked into my boss's office the next day, and I resigned. And Sandy looked at me, and she said, what are you doing? And I said, look, you got to have somebody to blame. And, I was the one who was in charge of negotiations, and, so blame me, and she kind of looked at me and she said, look, and for those who don't remember Sandy Feldman, she was a very tall, very strident woman who spoke in the way in which New York City school teachers used to speak, very didactically. She looked at me and she said, we got ourselves into this. We're going to get ourselves out of it. You can't take the easy route out. What do you think? You're going to be in here trying to fix it with me. I thought that was the most amazing moment of teaching that I had ever received. And what I've tried to do since then is that when something really terrible happens, the buck stops with me. And I don't care what we do internally, but the buck stops with me. And I'm going to be out there making sure if something really terrible happens, that if it happened under my watch, then I'm taking responsibility, and that the team together will help try to fix it.
So I sort of took from that hopeful tenacity, that you've got a really positive outlook, and you are advising tenacity and resilience.
Right. And resilience.
Yeah, because mistakes are going to happen, right?
All the time.
Yep. Sam, same question to you.
I would agree with what Randy said, the virtues of grace, humility, gratitude, especially being honored to represent working people. And two things came to mind when I considered this question. The one was, in the first summer in law school, you don't really have to work. And people say that's really your last chance. So if you want to go to Europe, you want to do anything, because the summer between second and third years, you really should be, working or clerking or doing something, legal internship. And the third year, of course, you should have a job and you should be studying for the bar exam. Well, the summer between first and second year of law school, I decided I wanted to work. And I was going to work for a solo practitioner. And when I went home for Christmas, I met her, we hit it off, and she said, oh, sure, you can work here for the summer. And so when I got home that summer, I couldn't find her. And so this probably was like the first instance of ghosting, right? So if we knew what ghosting was back then, that's exactly what she did to me. She ghosted me. So I was very upset. I was feeling sorry for myself, Randy, because I was younger. So my parents let me mope around for about 2 weeks. And they said, look, it didn't work out. You can make the best of it and just go volunteer. Just send some letters to some judges and just go volunteer. You don't have to pay rent anywhere. You have no other responsibilities. And so that's what I did. I sent letters to, I'm from a state where there are courts of equity and courts of law. So I sent to the Chancery Court judges and to the Circuit Court judges. And a Circuit Court judge took me up on my offer. So this was the early 90s, late 80s. And I was expected to make the coffee because it was that time in our world. So I did that. But I learned so much that summer. And it really changed the trajectory of my career. Because working for him, I got to see real life situations, right? Because he had everything. He had criminal cases, he had personal injury cases, he had small claims. So that was everything. And I met a man who would become a congressman. So I ended up working for him when I was in law school. That led to a clerkship, because a judge came to lobby him. The judge was lobbying for his alma mater. So that led to a clerkship, which led to teaching at the University of Mississippi for a year before I went to Columbia for my master's. And so what I had perceived as a setback was really something where I can kind of trace, it was circular, but I can trace my career to that attorney saying to me or ghosting me. And so not everything, and this is now hindsight, of course, is 20/20 vision, but so I didn't, at the time it was horrible, but as I look back on it, it really was a setback, but a setup rather for something much better. Much, much better. And with regard to, there are cases that you lose. And, I remember when I first started here and I'm trying to impress my current boss, we lost the trusteeship. Nobody loses a trusteeship. It's just impossible to lose a trusteeship. Well, we did. We were home courted and it was horrible. And it was horrible at the time. I remember to this day how badly I felt. I didn't go in, Randy, and resign, but I felt like I, needed to be somewhere, really doing penance. And what that taught me helped me 10 years into my job here when we had a really high stakes trusteeship, because I knew what not to do because of what had happened when I first started here. So it's stumbling blocks at the time, but take the lesson. There is always a lesson in the stumbling block, and you can use that to help you, because it's going to come up again where the issue arises and you say, oh no, I've been here before. I've seen this movie. It's not going to end that way this time.
That's great advice, Sam. Thank you. Nicole, same question.
So I thought about this one. And I think, the thing, and maybe mine isn't so much of an unconventional career decision or a setback, but more of an opportunity that I didn't know existed. When I left the government, my options were, I was going to go to work for Morgan Lewis, and my options were I was going to work in the DC office where they had lots of LMR attorneys, lots of support, or I could stay in California in Los Angeles and be the only labor attorney on the West Coast, which was risky from my perspective, because who knows where that leads, and that could succeed or that could fail. And I had never been in private practice before, but I thought, I'm going to try this, probably based on the confidence that I had gained from my first job, understanding that you can do it, right? You just have to commit to doing it. And I decided to take that path of, staying in Los Angeles and starting a practice. So, figuring out what clients to work with and figuring out my way through a brand new practice without any local guidance, right? And I think one of the really fantastic things that happened as a result is that I work with an incredibly generous group of lawyers who are really incredibly smart and very generous with their time, who, were kind enough to guide me and spend their time, invest their time in me and my career, and help me work on all the things that I had to work on, which was really what led to the success. Now we're a bustling West Coast practice. We have several lawyers. I think brought on former board member Harry Johnson a few years ago. I like to think that I brought him in. I did interview him. So he's in our Century City office. So we're now, a much larger group than when it was just little old me. But I think, what I learned from this is that there's a lot of fear in the unknown and in doing what is different and maybe something that you haven't seen done before. You don't have you're not sure you're going to have a whole lot of support. But if it's something you want, I knew I wanted to do this. I knew I wanted to be in Los Angeles. I knew I could do it. I got the support that I needed and was able to build around the practice we have now, working very hard with the lawyers that are in our labor management relations group. And so I think, look at the risks that you are presented with. And it's really hard. Change is really hard. I think change is hard for everyone, but imagining that you can accomplish whatever you set your mind to. And I know that's super lame and cliche, but I think it really is true. With the right support and the right leadership, take those opportunities, because you don't know where they're going to lead.
Well, and self-confidence is a huge aspect of success, right? So, if our self-confidence we can pull it back after we make mistakes, which I have to do every day because I make a mistake every day. I think that's very helpful. We've got Randy for one more question, and I know that she's actually being pulled already to be where she needs to be, but I'm going to ask it anyway. We now have more women graduating college than men, and yet women are still underrepresented in leadership roles. Talk to us about that. What's your view on that?
So I can do the non-political, or I can do the political. And so let me do a little bit of both, which is that I think we are in a pretty dark time in the country right now. I think we had, before the recession of 2008, you saw a lot more of a march towards a lot more opportunity and equality in terms of women and men, less so in terms of racial issues, but more so in terms of women and men. I saw, for example, so many times, like, I was the head of the Municipal Labor Committee in New York City while I was the head of the UFT. And that was all of the public sector unions, including police and fire and others. And I was many times one of the only women that was in leadership. But the flip side is they wanted me to be there. This was something that, as much as I would tease about how the cops and firefighters, would say all sorts of things behind my back, they didn't want me to leave. They wanted me to be in that position. But there was, you felt that you were, the game changer, at least for me, the game changer person in a lot of different places during that period of time, but it was embraced. I think what's happened over the course of the last 10 years in particular, is that there has been a real change in the economics. This is pre-pandemic. Now we're going to have a whole nother between Great Resignation and all of the polarization and things like that. I don't think that we have written the story for the next 5 years or so, although I do think that the issues around compassion and grace and meeting people where they are, and it's what's said, not what's heard, things I learned as I taught, are really, really important right now, both for leadership as well as how you navigate. So I think that what happened was when the economy started changing so much and there was a contraction, or there was the fear of the unknown, or there was the fear of diversity, then then there was Donald Trump. This is where I get political. There was a sense of people pulling back and that, be in your place. And you could see this in some of the misogyny, and you see it in some of the racism. And so you see corporate America trying to do something different. You see it in all the DEI work. You see unions trying to do something different, but there's a lot of this, where is the world going? Do I have control of my life anymore? The level of antipathy and anger and anxiety, and that has created a bunch of retrenchment before COVID and now during COVID. But this is what I would say to the women leaders or women who are listening to this. I think post-COVID, there's huge opportunities. I know it sounds kind of like, what? But people want to find aspiration and hope again. And a lot of women have the virtue of not just starting from a position of care and compassion, but they've worked really hard to be where they are. They often work harder to get where they are than a man works. They don't get the benefit of the doubt. So what happens is you become and have that resilient tenacity plus the care and compassion. And what I think we need to do as women leaders is, and do this not only for women, but we need to do this in a racially just way, is that we have to be the supporters and be the helpers, like Mr. Rogers has said. And we have to show the paths can be had for leadership that are about intentional collaboration, teamwork, not taking responsibility, but ways in which we bring people together and we find the best of each other, as opposed to a competitive dog-eat-dog kind of strategy. And I feel really, I think that helps create a better workplace balance. It helps create a better understanding. And the more we can create that kind of shared experience and lived experience, I think that's where there's a uniqueness to female leadership.
That's terrific. I think we'd all agree that our mentors, you began with it, Randy, our mentors make a huge difference in our trajectory, and we all have the opportunity to mentor other women leaders, for sure. So I now know that I've kept you actually quite a bit longer than you felt. I know that there's people waiting for you, so I just want to thank you so much and appreciate your time with us today. It's been
welcome. Thank you. My honor. Thanks.
Sam, I'm going to turn to you.
Mary, I'm going to echo what Randy said and also what you said. In thinking about this question, two words came to mind, and it's opportunity and access. And we've all talked about the importance of having mentors. The three general counsels before me were not women, and they were not people of color, but they saw something in me. The erstwhile international president and my boss now also saw leadership potential in me and provided the support and the mentorship and the sponsoring. But it really is opportunity, access. We each have to commit to serving as mentors and doing for those who are 5, 10 years, 15 years younger than we are. We have to commit to being the sponsors for them and supporting them in their careers. I mean, and I guess what immediately came to mind when reading this question was the nomination of Judge Katandi Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court. So it's 233 years, 115 other people, right? 115 times, no one thought to nominate a Black woman. I mean, and so now the list, okay, that's one off the list, but there's a whole lot of other people who we can just put, fill in the blank. But it really is about looking beyond what your, maybe what your gender, your demographic is, because the bar has to be those in leadership, right? That it's, if they're women who are outpacing men in all of these categories, but when you look at the heads of Fortune 500 companies or the heads of unions or not-for-profit, whatever it is, right? You put it there, the university presidents, it then has to be somebody at that level. So that leadership has to be intentional about looking beyond what their demographic may be and bringing on other people, giving them the opportunity, giving them the access, because they're qualified. It's not even a matter, I think, of that. It really is about having opportunity and access. And if Randy, Nicole, Mary, and I commit to sponsoring people who, regardless of gender or race, and making an effort also, though, to look for women to bring along and to sponsor and to give advice to, we can also help make some of that change. I had the opportunity of going to a webinar that a workshop that one of my friends does every year. She's in corporate America, and it's really a great workshop. And one year she had Vernon Jordan as the keynote speaker for lunch. And he talked about his career, which started, I mean, he was born in the segregated South, but someone saw something in him and exposed him to to education, And then he ends up counseling presidents, kings, princes. And he said what he did was to look in his firm and look for people whom he could mentor and bring along. And there were a number of women whom he had mentored and sponsored and provided support to, who were given just tremendous opportunities and access. And that was one of the most impactful speeches and impactful lunches I've had, that it was it's not just about you being where you are and closing the door behind you. It really is about bringing other people up.
Yeah, I just love the word sponsor. I think that's such a fabulous way to talk about how we can support one another. And so I also think your point is very well taken. Your advocate, your sponsor, your mentor may not be a woman, may be very different from you and bring different lived experience, and that can still draw you up. And I appreciate the call to arms, which I'm happy to take, which is that we all can be sponsors. Talent exists everywhere, and we can rise that talent up together, I think, and help the people that come after us maybe have a slightly easier pathway in some of the things that maybe we struggled with. Nicole.
I think, and I completely agree with everything that Sam said. And I think it's so, so important to look for those opportunities to mentor the next generation into leadership. I also think there's just a couple of things I think that, you see today that sort of lead to these issues. One is, women they're just stereotypes. People expect women to be a certain way. The leadership traits of women are often viewed negatively, although men exhibit the same kinds of traits. I think as lawyers in the marketplace, we can be just like consumers are to any product, right? We can give our labor to organizations that we feel align with our values. And so, I think one way to help change things, certainly bring up the next generation of leadership, but also support those organizations that are supportive of women, and not just and that they have a DEIB program, right? Because everybody has that now, but that really it's not lip service. They really are committed to families. They're committed to DEIB initiatives. They're really committed to women. They're committed to diversity. They live it. I feel I'm just nonstop talking about how fortunate I feel for everything, but I feel really fortunate that my firm is a really incredible example of that. I know I mentioned her already. We have an amazing chairwoman. I don't know how or if she ever has sleeps at all, because she does so much, but our firm is, number one in hiring practices for gender equity and family friendliness. We have a Mansfield certification, top 15 glass ceiling report. Look for organizations, spend your capital, your personal capital on organizations that you feel like are going to make a difference. And if you're, at any organization, demand that your organization promote diversity and women in leadership roles. I mean, we have the opportunity in leadership now to be making those demands, but even as everybody that is working, every lawyer is important to their organization. And I think, really supporting those firm initiatives or organization initiatives wherever you are, make your voice heard, that's what's important to you. It's important to you to see leadership that looks like you, that looks diverse. I think those things are how we can move the process along. I do think things are changing. There's a lot more women. I'm sure, Sam would say, and Mary, I'm sure you would too, that when I started in labor law, it was a lot of men. Traditional labor is like a very male driven, has been traditionally. It hasn't been as, lately you can see the change, right? There's a lot more women at the bargaining table, a lot more women in leadership on both sides of the table. I think that is all good, but I think we can use our capital to sort of move things along, to get to a better place by, committing your services to places that are supportive of the things that you value. And if you're in-house, push for your organization to hire outside counsel that's diverse. There are lots of organizations that have that now. And so I think those are the things that we can probably do on a day-to-day basis too, in addition to the mentoring of the next generation of leadership that, will push organizations to really do better and be better.
Those are great comments. And I think so advocacy is incredibly important, but I love the recommendation that you made that where you can actually make a difference, like when you hire an outside counsel, be a voice for diversity in that population that you consider. I'd also say we're going to segue to the last question for Sam and Nicole, and then we're going to take your questions. And I've gotten a couple so far, and so we'll turn to those. But I'd also say before we segue is that I think women are still traditionally the caregivers in their families. That is still, in most families, still not equalized. And whether it's children or anyone else, they tend to have most of the care responsibilities, which makes the issue of access to childcare really, really important. So before we turn to the questions which are coming in, let me ask you about today. Tell me a little bit about where you are today, and kind of where your head is at and what you're thinking about your roles today. Sam?
Oh, wow, a hard one. Where I am today, I was trying to think if I would have answered this question differently pre-pandemic. But where I am today is we represent, as I said, workers who are in entertainment. And we are a union that has been recession-proof. We were depression-proof. We were war-proof. But we found out we were not pandemic-proof. So we were at one point nearly, 95, 98% unemployed because of the nature of the work that we do. And so we are at the point in the union of getting our industries back up. And while I was preparing earlier today for this, I'm reading reports, about some Broadway shows where there've been outbreaks and, and just really trying to ride the waves of these various COVID variants. So we are very much in the hour by hour, day by day, really trying to safely to ensure that our members are safe, that the theater going public and those who attend live events are safe, and really trying to ensure that the industry gets back going and not just have to deal with all the vagaries of trying to come out of a pandemic. So that is where I am professionally, right? Just really trying to provide whatever leadership, whatever legal advice the international president, my employers, and the general executive board require at this time, and also to be available, to our members who are really clawing back from tremendous financial disadvantages. I mean, things that just shut the industry down. I'm not telling you all anything you don't know. Professionally, I am at the point where I am thinking more intentionally and trying to be more intentional about what Nicole just said about, ensuring that there are diversity. So working with our diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, which is fabulous. It's led by two women co-chairs who are just absolutely phenomenal. We have a very active Pride committee that deals with LGBTQIA plus issues. And so making sure that the union, I think Nicole just said this, is reflective of the society and the membership we represent. Our boss, President Loeb, is definitely doing that to make sure that the union is reflective of all of the membership, while primarily, of course, ensuring that the mission of the union and that the National Labor Relations Act, of course, is enforced with regard to our membership. But intentionally, I am trying desperately to focus on pouring into the next generation and also being a voice and trying to affect whatever change I can from the seat I hold.
Thank you, Sam. So intentionality and I'd say again, tenacity, being willing to get out there and push on some of the issues that are too easily recede if we're not careful to keep them in the forefront. Nicole?
As much as there's so much negativity right now, I feel like things are tough, right? Time is tough in the country. I think the one very positive thing that's happening, though, is that the world seems to be changing, or at least this country is changing, right? Workers have different views on things today than they did 3 years ago. And I think the pandemic has a lot to do with it. A lot of workers now across the country sound like the Manhattan workers when I was in New York City, right? It's just a much stronger, more united feeling. Randy talked about the Great Resignation, right? That's certainly part of it. There's been a lot of strikes coming out of collective bargaining. And so, things like that, that has been very interesting, and it's a very interesting evolution of the labor movement. So I feel like the labor movement is changing very rapidly. The traditional labor as sort of like, how do we practice? How do we negotiate contracts? How do we relate has always been pretty much the same, right? And so when clients come to you with an issue, we want to negotiate a collective bargaining agreement. Hey, we're thinking about rolling out a new policy, and we're talking to them about those things. The lens that we're looking at those things with was very different 3 years ago than it is today. And I think understanding where the general public is, and understanding where workers in a particular industry are, and the things that they've been facing for the last several years of a pandemic has really spurned sort of a very interesting, creative, more collaborative kind of work in putting together advice for clients and in helping them through things, which I think has been really very interesting. I think it's a very different feeling when you're negotiating a collective bargaining agreement. The things you might have said 3 years ago are different than the things you would say now. The issues that you're going to have at the table are very different than the issues you're going to have at the table now. And so being creative and really understanding where people are coming from has been a very interesting learning experience. I think that's where I spend a lot of my time now. And of course, trying to figure out what TikTok is and all of these other social media apps that you apparently have to know how to use if you're going to understand the youth today. But it's also brought in, I think, when you look at the younger generation of lawyers, their perspective is so much more like they're so much more creative, right? They're of this generation. They understand this movement. They're part of this, and so their creativity and the collaboration has really changed a lot within traditional labor and the traditional labor space. And that's what I've been working on today.
Yeah, and I also think, to pick up on what Nicole has just said, this last 2.5 years, right, has been one where we were collectively going through the same thing at the same time, right? Because after everybody had kind of exhausted the Netflix catalog, the Prime catalog, we were all back to watching must-see TV, right? So we were all watching Tiger King or Michael Jordan's The Last Dance, right? I couldn't be anywhere but in front of my TV watching ESPN for 10 weeks in 2020 or 2021. And social media made the world very small. And we couldn't go anywhere. We couldn't do anything. And so we were all, it was the very real, like, immediacy. So you're living in 2020, 2021, but it really felt like it must have been, like it must have felt in the 1950s or 1960s, because everything was just focused on whatever it is at that time, right? At whatever was going on at that time. And so there is a shift. I'm not sure we're through it yet. I don't know how long it'll last, but there is this shift. There was the pandemic, which made us all, the world stop. And then there's whatever is happening now, right? And it hasn't, I don't think it has all shaken out yet.
I agree, Sam. I agree. We have yet to figure out what, I don't like this term, but I'm going to use it anyway, the new normal is. I think we haven't recalibrated completely yet. And I think it can create both excitement and nervousness, the idea that we don't know what the future will hold. But I agree with Nicole, things are changing, and we're all gonna figure that out together. I want to start getting to questions because we've got some terrific ones. And so let me start with the first one. Can you discuss some pathways to union labor management careers besides law? For example, I'm interested in the role technology can play in the future of labor in the US. Sam or Nicole, who wants to start?
I mean, I'm happy to jump in. I think there are so many companies that are looking for labor relations professionals right now. I can't even tell you. I have constantly just tell clients now, I'm out of ideas. There's only so many people that do this work, help companies advise them on their labor relations. It's not necessarily a legal job. So negotiating of collective bargaining agreements, handling grievances, things like that are jobs that there are a lot of non-lawyers that do at companies. That doesn't necessarily utilize technology, although, when you talk about communicating with your workforce in a union or a non-union environment, certainly that understanding technology and putting together you want to talk to your employees how they like to talk, right? And if that is through TikTok, or if that is through a tweet or a text or a posting on the wall or on an iPad, whatever the communication method is, you want to meet them there. And so if you're a person who is, driven by technology, that is definitely a need that lots of companies have, help communicating with employees on all kinds of topics in the workplace. It's not necessarily always going to be labor management relations, although there's a lot of work to be done there.
And I think that's part of the shift that we are going through now. I mean, with the organizing of Amazon, that is a technology company, right? And so it's been really interesting to follow what's going on in Bessemer and what's going on in Staten Island and the way they are communicating with the unit. And it is, as I said, technology companies, and there are, unions which are organizing technology companies, but also there are, worker centers that are also looking at ways to give the workers a collective voice in the technology sector. So I would say go for it. I'm not one who's on social media, so I can't speak the specific lingo, but I believe there probably is opportunity there, because if you have imagined it and if you're thinking about it, I would think that there is an opportunity there to be examined, and please explore it.
And I know I focused on management side, but Sam, that just jogged my sort of memory. Like if you look at a more perfect union, for example, or Starbucks Workers United, and if you're interested in working on the labor side, they do some incredible stuff technologically, right? They set up interviews, they do videos, they create all kinds of content. And so there's opportunity on both sides to do very similar work, but it's definitely out there.
So this is sort of related to the start of that question, which is some pathways into the union labor management career besides law. Can you talk about the HR role in labor management relations? Nicole, you want to give it a start?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we started with the last question. I do think that there's a lot of organizations that have an internal HR function that isn't necessarily legal, but likely works with their internal legal department or external legal resources that manages sort of the day-to-day, grievance processing, or if people have issues, they would come to that HR professional and say, hey, this is my issue and can you help me? Negotiating contracts, working, behind the scenes to develop proposals and things like that. So I think HR is a really, really important function to, and then I think law, is important too, to sort of check and make sure that all of those ideas are good ones. But it's an important, HR is an incredibly important function to, I think, the labor management relationship. They're often the sort of gatekeeper, first line communicators.
Sam?
Absolutely, Nicole. We at the IA deal with labor relations. Those are the people we primarily deal with regard to collective bargaining, grievance handling, and many of them, not all, many of them are attorneys, but I'm not sure that it is necessarily a qualification. But that is where we spend most of our time. I know people will often say, oh, you work, for people who are camera, you represent the camera people and the makeup and hair, and they're thinking that you are working with the Denzels and the Brad Pitts. And I'm like, well, our members do. I am a labor lawyer. That's what the staff legal department does at the IATSE. So, but our members, of course, do work with talent. But our job is primarily with the labor relations professionals who are in the HR departments at the studios and at the theaters and concert promoters we represent.
So maybe I'll just add a little bit here, even though I'm the moderator, which is to say HR broadly, not just in the labor relations area, should be, and I think in most cases is, has prioritized their workforce. It's very hard to get people. It's very hard to keep them. And I think, unfortunately, too often we focus on the points where we may disagree, where there's a financial issue or a work rule issue or something along those lines. That's sort of inevitable when you're dealing with large, complicated situations. But at the core, I hope, and I'm sure this isn't true in absolutely every case, but I hope in the core, we actually have a common value, which is that we want people to be, to feel actualized and comfortable in their roles, safe, and can see themselves in their roles or our new roles for a long time. And so there is a commonality, and that focus, that commonality of care and concern can drive even difficult times when we don't agree, can drive the parties, I think, to agreement. So HR has a huge role to play in the culture of the relationship between the union and management. And it can play that role in a variety of ways. But in my experience, if you accept the premise, which is we all share the same interest, which is to have our employees feel heard and safe and diverse talent, then we have more in common than we have difference. The next question. I love this call to arms. I came in a little late, so excuse me if this is addressed, but I would love some discussion around women supporting women and where that lacks too often. My best and worst supporters seem to be women in my world. Sam, I started with Nicole last time. Sam?
Well, I can't address the personal aspect of the question, but there are some really good, I believe, female-centered, woman-centered organizations that I know. For example, in New York, we have New York Women in Film and Television, which is comprised of people from in front of the camera to behind the camera. If you have a connection to film and television and you're a woman, and men, I'm sure, are members as well, but that is an organization that is focused on promoting and supporting women creatives and women who are working in entertainment. There is a similar organization in LA, Nicole, and I can't think of the name. I know Melissa Silverstein, I think, runs that organization. But again, women connected to entertainment can find support there. I am a member of the Westchester Women's Bar Association, and there's very good programming, Mary, that deals with the issues that working women face. So where you are, still, let's just admit it, we are the primary caregivers for if there are children in the household, or if you are, in the sandwich generation and you're also assisting with elder care. So they deal with those issues as well as just practice issues. But meeting women professionals, meeting women lawyers or creatives or whatever the organization is, where they are. With regard to politics, I know there's Emily's List, where they vet women for political office because there are issues that we want women to bring forward in legislatures, right? So I would encourage, and I think Nicole said this earlier, looking for those organizations because they're out there. I, as I said, named the ones that I'm affiliated with because they speak to issues that I have. But there are, even in I think in the New York State Bar Association, as well as in the ABA, there are groups that deal with issues particular to whatever the group is, if it's LGBTQ or if it's women, if it's attorneys of color or women of color. So I would strongly encourage the participant to look into those groups.
Yep, thank you, Sam. And I think that highlights the fact that maybe your mentor is not going to be, maybe you'll be disappointed that the mentor is not somebody in your hierarchy. But I think there are networks out there. I think that was your point. Keep looking, and you may find them in associations. Nicole?
Yeah, I think as a mentee, as a person who is looking for support, I think everybody's had good bosses and bad bosses, but finding that support from whomever it is, and we talked about this earlier, right? It might not be a woman. It might not be someone that looks like you. Your mentor, the who will actually take the time to invest in you and invest in your career may be a man, and that's okay too. But finding that person who cares about what it is that you want to do in your career and helping you get the experience and exposure to the things that you need to be exposed to and experienced with in order to advance and become a leader. And of course, as leaders, right, you have to find those people who want to advance, who care about their careers and their jobs in a way that they're looking to be leaders, and find them and meet them. I love what Sam, you said, like, meet them where they are, figure out what they want to do, who they want to be, and help them, see those things, work on those kinds of issues, and get the exposure they need in order to advance into the leadership, leadership roles that they're looking for.
And one of my mentors is someone who is not in labor. He's actually in management. And whenever I have wanted to make a career decision, I reach out to him. So it is exactly as Nicole said, someone who is interested in you. And it may be a woman, but it may well be, a man, and it may not be someone in your practice area. As I said, this is a person who I sit across the table from every 3 years. But his advice has been just invaluable to me.
So last question for both of you, and you've been wonderful. Thank you so much. Do you see women leadership growing? And if so, how? Sam?
I see it growing. And today I was on a call earlier with union side labor lawyers. And I believe more than half of the call were women. And in the same group, we have a general counsel's call. And at one point, I suppose we could have had the general counsels for labor unions probably, fit on the first page of a Zoom screen. And now I believe it may be 2.5 screens. So I do see it.
Nicole?
Yeah, I see it too. I see it in the next generation of people that are interested in this work. We have a lot of women associates who love doing this work. And I think it's really an incredible, as a practice area, it's an incredible practice area. The people are quirky. It is fun work. It is people who are genuine and real. It is very different than most other practice areas, at least as far as I've seen. And so I think women have realized sort of their value in that conversation. And I'm absolutely seeing it too. In the clients that we work with, lots of women lawyers are doing traditional labor. So it's exciting. We can do more, but I think we're doing pretty well.
Well, that's a great way to wrap up. So very hopeful. And I want to thank our panelists. They were remarkable. Randy, Sam, Nicole, thank you so much. And I want to thank you all for participating in this. I hope you found it as informative as I did. All of our panelists are very busy, and so we know what it took to carve this much time out of their schedules. As I mentioned at the beginning, for those of you who are interested in exploring a career in labor relations, the PCCW is sponsoring a summer fellowship in labor and employment policy and practice. You can find more information about this at experience.edu, keyword search PCCW. We're right at 6 o'clock Eastern time. Once again, thank you all very much.